Pues muy buenos días. Soy Peter Carrera, director de la NAC, Latin American, North American Church Concerns. Good morning to everyone. Bienvenidos a todos y a todas. And welcome to Romero Days 2019. So before we get started, I just want to make sure everyone knows the kind of housekeeping arrangements. We have restrooms on this floor. I think the men's room is down that way and the women's room is just around the corner. We'll be here all morning, so you're in the right place. Many thanks are in order for the preparations that went into this event. And I wanted to acknowledge that from the beginning to the Kellogg staff, particularly Therese Hamlin, Sharon Shirley, Judy Bartlett, Karen Clay, to the many presenters who are here. A few are still stuck in Atlanta, sadly, but they're on their way. But for all the people that came from San Salvador, from Los Angeles, from that little town with the two baseball teams, Chicago, from all the people that came from all over the globe, from Fordham, we welcome you. And of course to Lupe Ramirez and the student assistants, Diego Garcia and Camila Antelo Edgardo. Let's give everyone a big hand. So just a few remarks to get us on our way today. The Second Vatican Council, as many of you know, called upon Catholics to read the signs of the times in the light of the gospel. Our reading of the signs of the times today has its own brief history that I'd just like to recount very quickly. LANOC, Latin American, North American Church Concerns, has sponsored an annual Romero Days conference since 1987. With this year's event, we celebrate the 32nd annual memorial and do so 39 years after the tragic assassination of Oscar Romero and just 6 months after the canonization of San Romero de las Americas. Father Pelton was with us. Father Robert Pelton, the LANOC's venerable founder, was with us last night at the dinner. I'm sure he'll be here later today. But Father Pelton never envisaged a pope, at least not at the beginning, who would canonize Romero when he made the commitment to found LANOC in 1985. Father Bob, some of you know from long history, had lobbied on campus and before Notre Dame clubs around the country about the need to promote civil and human rights in Latin America while respecting and promoting the agendas of the Church of Latin America. His interest in Romero arose even before the assassination and was triggered by his earlier experiences watching the Chilean church fight against the dictatorship of Pinochet. Here I'm just going to quote from an article written by Tara Hunt McMullen in Notre Dame Magazine, spring 2017. What led me to study Oscar Romero was I saw history repeating itself, Pelton says. So much of the situation in El Salvador was reminiscent of Chile, the political jockeying, the suppression of the poor, the influence of North America. But a vital element was missing. There was a strong resistance from the bishops in Chile, speaking about Manuel Larín, Raúl Silva Enriquez, whereas he continued in El Salvador, there was not the same strength of leadership at the level of bishops. Father Bob had learned from the bold bishops of Chile in the 1960s what it meant to promote justice in Latin America. He started Romero Days to bear witness to what he learned in the then progressive and then exemplary Church of Chile. Father Bob waited patiently for the church to catch up with his bold vision of justice. Over the years, many of you know this, many dark forces were at work, originally in the Salvadoran Episcopal Conference itself, and then in the Vatican to keep this canonization from happening. But Father Bob not only attended the canonization in Rome on Sunday, October 14, 2018, but we were able in the fall to host an event with Father Bob and Carmen Nanco Fernandez from the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, in which, at that time, Father Bob underscored the historic nature of what had just transpired. And you can look up that event on our webpage. We have the full video of that amazing story of Father Bob's trip to Rome and Carmen Nunco's prophetic words about not getting lax regarding the witness of Romero. So Father Bob will be with us later today. He's our always energetic guide and mentor. At 97, he hasn't lost his steam. I call him Ponce de Leon, the eternal fountain of youth. He's guiding us now in a new project to help the Archdiocese of San Salvador in its request to see Oscar Arnulfo Romero named a pastoral doctor of the church. So we've achieved canonization, or the church has achieved canonization, but there's no reason to stop with that. And that would be an important step. I mean, the first doctor of the church, I believe, was St. Ambrose of Milan, and if so recognized, Romero would become the first Latin American doctor of the church. So that's for the future, and that's something about what we're hoping to do in the coming years. So now a word about our conference, Belonging the Church of Romero and the Gangs. The triumph of a canonization of a martyr for justice is no excuse to rest on our laurels. Romero's own laurels, so to speak, were soaked in blood that poured out of his side due to the bullet of an assassin. And we are not allowed to wash those laurels of that stain, even after a joyous celebration in the Vatican. St. Oscar de las Americas impels us to think and act in new and creative ways about the reality in front of us here and now. Throughout the Americas, young women and men are choosing gangs instead of a path of peace. So we chose as our theme, Belonging the Church of Romero and the Gangs, in order to create a new form of solidarity and a new way to share information and perspectives across the border that divides North and South. Young people, I was just talking to Camilo Alvarez about his experience in LA, and he verified this. Young people are eager to belong. La cuestión de pertenencia. They are, one author put it, hardwired to connect. So we wanted to interrogate the reasons why people join gangs and the reasons why or why not the church or the churches might be an alternative, a more peaceful alternative, a more fulfilling form of belonging. We are not unaware of the political rhetoric, sometimes violent, that encircles our efforts. Gang violence is stigmatized by the President of the United States as a Salvadoran invasion, even though the problem originated in Los Angeles and was exported to Latin America. President Trump has frequently justified his immigration policy based upon the violence of MS-13 street gang. 2 days before his State of the Union address, a horrible, horrible shooting took place on a Queens subway platform. The shooter was without papers, had a criminal record, and was on bail after being arrested in a gang takedown last December. The victim was also undocumented and alleged to be a member of the 18th Street gang. Parents of 2 teenage girls who were killed by MS-13 attended the State of the Union as guests of the president. Now, we need to state unequivocally that these acts of violence have no excuse and are rightly condemned by our president. But the president's statement that he will introduce legislation to stop the gangs from, and I quote here, breaking into the United States is simply not accurate. There is not a well-documented correlation between the long-standing presence of MS-13 violence in the U.S. and the recent influx of illegal immigrants. We're not whitewashing the new attention being paid to gang violence by the president and his admirers, but we'd like to place it in its proper historical context. U.S. bishops and Salvadoran bishops have been meeting for years to discuss these issues. And I should mention, in addition to the delegation we have from Chicago and Los Angeles here at this conference, we've also had some contact with Auxiliary Bishop Mario Dorsenville in Washington, D.C. We wanted to be here but couldn't. We read in the papers, Archdiocese of Washington's in a little bit of trouble. But he's very eager to know how this goes here. I'm very eager to take what we're doing to Catholic U or to the Archdiocese of Washington. I grew up in the Archdiocese of Washington, and I always considered myself Salvadoran for that reason. I think it's the 3rd largest Salvadoran city in the world. So Romero Days 2019 will show how a diverse host of leaders who wish to honor Oscar Romero might respond pastorally and politically to the transnational reality of gang violence. Romero himself foreshadowed a new form of violence that would reign in El Salvador even after the end of the violence inflicted by an oppressive regime. Romero knew better than anyone that violence by its very nature spirals, and that in the process of spiraling, it can take many forms. Our dear friend Carlos Colorado, who was here last year, reports that Romero prophesied that the Salvadorans would find themselves in the situation in which they now find themselves. What's coming is going to be terrible, Romero told his brother. No one can stop the war now. In a homily from September 25th, 1977, he explained what he meant. But the worst thing is what comes after the war now. Romero continued, the names for violence will change, but there will always be violence as long as we do not change the roots that cause this violence and so many other horrible things that occur daily in our nation. End quote. His third and his fourth pastoral letters cited Medellin to the effect that institutionalized violence is firmly and dramatically a fact of life in our country. The structures of violence need to be confronted, whether they issue directly from the state, from oligarchical opposition to agrarian reform, from right-wing death squads, from terrorism, from spontaneous insurrections, or even from the conditions of gross inequality. In the face of unjust structures of violence, Romero urged his fellow Christians to be peaceful, but not to be passive. The violence of love, as you know, was his watchword. He wrote eloquently about the moral force of nonviolence, knowing that Medellin had already defended the same principle in 1968. Romero reminded us that there's no peace without justice. Romero's witness to nonviolence and a just revolution of social strife is alive in El Salvador today. Rick Jones, who's with us today from CRS, reported to our Sunday visitor, reporter Brian Fraga, on September 25th, 2018, that he encounters poor and marginalized people in El Salvador with a picture of Romero and carrying posters and marches to remember his witness. Members of a youth group in one of San Salvador's most violent neighborhoods named their group after Monsignor Romero. They heard about, Rick said, they heard about this guy whose message was about nonviolence and about living differently and stopping the violence. They said, that's exactly what we want to be. This year's conference will allow for a focus on Romero's commitment to transnational nonviolence, both in dialogue and action, with the mission of bringing his commitment to human development through nonviolence into a new era. Hardly a new effort. Romero, as you know, beseeched President Jimmy Carter for his help in stopping the U.S. government support for the military and brutal violence in El Salvador. The president ultimately ignored Romero despite his reputed focus on human rights. So we don't want to make the same mistake as President Carter. Now, a word about the fact that we're picking up a theme that has already been addressed by the Church of El Salvador. I see violence and strife in the city. The current Archbishop of El Salvador, Monsignor Jose Luis Escobar Alas, wrote a pastoral letter about 3 years ago on the feast of Oscar Romero that relates to pernicious gang violence in El Salvador. I see violence and strife in the city, and I'm happy to report that we have a few copies for free available on the table outside if you want to pick one up. Unfortunately, Archbishop Escobar Alas is not here to lay out his vision for ameliorating the social exclusion that led to structural violence in El Salvador. But in that interesting letter, he acknowledges that its roots extend back to the colonial period and that Oscar Romero was a timely prophet in the line of many prophets who pursued the path of nonviolence. Most of all, however, the current Archbishop acknowledges with Romero that the root cause of violence is social exclusion. And the principal reasons for social exclusion are the lack of real justice without impunity and and I quote him here, I'm not making this up, the idolatrous worship of mammon. The idolatrous worship of mammon. Regarding the latter, he states very clearly, we need an economy of solidarity where job opportunities are increased considerably, even if it means reducing profits for large national and multinational corporations. End of quote. So pious rhetoric about the sin of individualism and the overcoming of other forms of social fragmentation need to be combined with this prophetic language of reimagining the economy in a transnational way. Only with the big picture of economic globalization and how to confront it in view can we possibly speak to the reality of violence that we confront, whether it's in Queens or in San Salvador. So let's use this opportunity of coming together across the divide that separates Central America from the heartland of the US to think big about the problem we have chosen to address. Many attempts have been made by academic groups and NGOs to alleviate gang violence with little success. We will hear more about this in the coming days, about the stories of lament and the stories of hope. But I wanted to quote a comment made by Mauricio Gavirit of the Universidad Central America. It's a little review he did of the book that Tom Hare wrote called Zonas Peligras, and I thought it was noteworthy. Hare investigated 4 neighborhoods in an attempt to quantify the relative merits of social organization theories, as opposed to militarized policing, what is called in Latin America, la mano dura, or heavy-handed approaches. Hare's results were not conclusive, but Gavirit still favored their dissemination in the light of the fact that some politicians gained office on the basis of the claim that la mano dura is the only possible way to end violence. So after this conference is over, just a little plug for my colleague, Tom. Right, there's Tom. After this conference is over, Hare and the Notre Dame Initiative for Global Development will be hosting 2 Central America dialogues, one on April 27, 2019, in Antigua, Guatemala, and a second one on June 15th, in the new offices of the Keough School for Global Affairs in Washington, D.C. So it's a plug, but it's also a way of thinking about the fact that we're here for a few days, we're going to have a wonderful time, but this week is only the beginning, not the end of dialogue. More than anything else, I think we need to examine ourselves, starting with our awareness of what it means to share a space of a church that spans the Americas. We in Lanark are also willing to look at our own complicity here in the US. For example, Mark and Louise Zwick of the Houston Catholic Worker, when they read Archbishop Alice's I See Violence and Strife in the City, wrote prophetically from a US perspective. They wrote in their newspaper, the Houston Catholic Worker, we would like to add that our country bears a responsibility to help the Salvadoran people in a new and peaceful way, including putting a stop to deporting Salvadoran people as they flee the violence back to impossible situations. So both the church and the state in the US need to clean up their act before they can be full participants in a dialogue about international cooperation. The Zwicks make possible a way forward that starts with the cleansing of the North American heart and a new impetus, a new challenge to offer hospitality to the stranger. And finally, just a word about how we're going to proceed. This week, we'll take a fresh new look at the problem that has bedeviled both our countries since at least the 1970s and 80s. We want to conduct this dialogue in an open and free manner, sharing as many different perspectives as possible. In fact, 3 things are new, I think, in the approach that we want to take regarding the forms of belonging in the gangs across national boundaries and with a historical perspective. First, we want to focus on and evaluate the role of the church as a possible, and the churches as a possible agent of change. And I mean this in an ecumenical sense. And even though I think you might be one of the people stuck in Atlanta, but people like Pastor Nelson Moss from the Ebenezer Church in Aldina in San Salvador is one of our distinguished participants. Sometimes ecumenical conversations are hard to start, whether it's in Latin America or in the US. So we're pleased to do what we can to foster them in whatever way that we can. Second, we're employing an interdisciplinary method of investigation that spans the study of religion, culture, and politics. This doesn't mean that we're just sharing empirical data. Culture, politics, economics, and the spiritual striving of the human person all come together in our meeting. And in fact, the prison poetry assembled by Jenna Knapp in her Tras la Máscara, Behind the Gangster's Mask, which is available for a small donation right outside this room, will be the center of our discussions with Father Gustavo Gutierrez this afternoon. Third, we're not offering, and this is very important, and I can end with this, we're not offering a ready-made solution based upon the alleged expertise of academics. We are utilizing a deliberately open-ended dialogical process of inquiry best described as accompaniment. We're proposing to enter into the reality in order to meet and support the people who know more about it than we can ever learn on our own. Our guests from San Salvador, from Los Angeles, from Chicago, and elsewhere have made a long journey to be with us here today, and we're supremely grateful for your presence. Our efforts will help to disseminate information and new perspectives about this process and will facilitate the formation of new partnerships to extend Romero's venerable legacy of the nonviolent promotion of justice into the present. So I conclude then by recalling the words of Pope Francis in the joy of the gospel regarding una cultura de encuentro, fostering a culture of encounter. He says in Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, number 220, people in every nation enhance the social dimension of their lives by acting as committed and responsible citizens, not as a mob swayed by powers that be. Let us not forget that responsible citizenship is a virtue, and participation in political life is a moral obligation. Yet becoming a people, very important to the Pope, especially our pertenencia y el pueblo. Becoming a people demands something more. It's an ongoing process in which every new generation must take part. A slow and arduous effort, calling for a desire for integration and the willingness to achieve this through the growth of a peaceful and multifaceted cultura de encuentro, culture of encounter. I would think in Spanish it sounds much better. Encuentro, you translate as a meeting, like more meetings? No. Cultura de encuentro. So there's no real meaning to being a people of God without real mechanisms for fostering this cultura de encuentro, this culture of encounter. Of the principles that the Pope invokes to foster this culture, I'd just like to recall one, because he has all of these mantras. The whole is greater than the parts, the reality is more greater than the idea. But the one I want to recall for us right now is time is greater than space. Time is greater than space. So we'll be together for 3 short days. Let's use the space of the Kellogg Institute to enkindle friendships and collaborations that can be nurtured over time. The fruits of our efforts go beyond these few days. Many of us will forget exactly what the other person said, but we can still maintain a relationship and a collegial sharing of information and viewpoints long after the conference ends. No one is going to figure out how to end gang violence in just 3 days, but we can offer a setting to exchange our most novel and exciting insights in such ways to direct the conversation into a more hopeful and promising domain of inquiry. We're going to be judged, in other words, by the quality of the questions we raise more so than by our pat answers and final conclusions. We are building bridges rather than walls. So LANOC has always been a synergy of efforts designed to bring 2 separate vantage points on the globe of Catholicism into dialogue with one another. And I wish everyone a blessing and un agradecimiento, a thank you from the bottom of my heart for your participation, help, encouragement, and support. So with that, I can turn over the podium to my colleague, Professor David Lantigua, who is in the Department of Theology with me. David received his PhD in the moral theology area of our department, working on both colonial thought, questions of civil rights, human rights, but all the way up to Romero. He went to Washington, D.C. for 4 years and taught at the Catholic University of America. And then, fortunately for us, he made the trek back to Notre Dame and has been with us. And he is preparing a manuscript. He has many publications. I'm not going to go through them all, so that give him time to introduce our first session. But just wanted to clue you into his next book, which is soon to be submitted to Cambridge University Press, will be entitled Church, Empire, and Infidels in a New World Order. So please join me in welcoming David Lantigua.
Thanks, Salvador, for coming. Thank you for coming near and far. Sorry, I have a bit of a cold, so I have to project here. It's my pleasure to moderate this first panel session on the background and history of gangs in El Salvador, and to introduce our presenters, our speakers. So our first speaker, we're going to go in order here as listed on the schedule. Dr. Robert Brenneman is an assistant professor of sociology at St. Michael's College in Vermont. His research focuses on the impact of violence and violent social structures on human flourishing. He received his MA and PhD from here at Notre Dame. His book, Homies and Hermanos, God and Gangs in Central America, was published by Oxford University Press in 2011. And it examines the lives of 63 former gang members, many of whom joined evangelical congregations in an attempt to extricate themselves from gang violence. Dr. Brenneman currently advises a team of Guatemalan researchers studying the impact of Pentecostal and Catholic charismatic movements on civic participation and social capital in Guatemala City. Dr. Jose Miguel Cruz is the Director of Research at the Latin American and Caribbean Center at Florida International University, where he's also a visiting assistant professor at the Department of Politics and International Relations. Dr. Cruz holds an MA in Public Policy in Latin America from Oxford University and a PhD in Political Science from Vanderbilt. He is an expert on Latin American gang violence, governance, democratization, public opinion, and he previously directed the University Institute of Public Opinion at El Salvador's Universidad Centroamericana, UCA. He has worked as a consultant for international organizations, including the World Bank and the United Nations Development Program. So we'll have each of them speak here for some time, and then there should be plenty of opportunity for questions, comments afterwards, and that'll take us into our lunch. So please join me in welcoming our presenters.
Okay. Well, thank you, Peter, for inviting me, and David for the introduction. I'm really delighted and excited to be here at this gathering for this topic and this sort of melding of two topics, that the life and testimony of Romero and the struggle with gang violence in Northern Central America. And I want to say, first of all, that I'm not unaware of the irony of starting a conference on the topic of gangs in El Salvador as a transnational form of belonging. That's the topic. It's a little bit ironic to start with a gringo to tell you about what the gangs are like. And I recognize that I am at my best. I'm trying to share from the 63 conversations that I had with former gang members in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. I'm not really a gang expert. I did, I think, learn something from speaking with those young men and a few young women, and the many men and women who worked with them in Central America in the 2000s. And, but I live and work and teach now, largely suburban, upper middle class Catholic kids from New England. So it's I've been a little bit out of the loop somewhat, but I will share with you some of the reflections that I drew from talking to ex-gang members. But first, I want to share my Romero story. And I think a lot of you probably have a Romero story of your own. And so I share this with you and in hopes that you can reflect on your own Romero story. My Romero story starts at a video store in Dowagiac, Michigan. Only people who live here will know where Dowagiac, Michigan is, and that maybe, which is where I grew up, in Southwest Michigan, about an hour north of here. And I was at that video store because my older brother sent me a letter. In a letter, said, Bob, you've got to watch this movie called Romero. This was 1992. I was a senior in high school, and my brother was a sophomore in college taking a Spanish class where he was learning all about what was happening. My brother is here today, and my parents and my other brother as well. I'm so delighted that they can be here. I wrote letters with my brothers in college. Stranger things have happened. Brothers, excuse me, writing each other. I'm really grateful for those letters. And the one in particular where my brother Conrad told me to watch this movie. He was all charged up about what he was learning in his Spanish class. And so I did what a little brother is supposed to do, but rarely does. And I listened to my older brother, And I went to the video store and rented this movie and brought it home and put the VHS in the machine and watched it on my own in the living room. And it changed my life. It really did. It changed the trajectory of my life. Not the video, but the testimony of Saint Romero. So I am deeply grateful to this day for older brothers and also for the testimony that Monsignor Romero left for many of us, including a young high school Mennonite kid who, oddly enough, was inspired by the story, perhaps because Romero's response to a very violent situation was to say, stop the violence, no more to the violence. I'm not here to argue that Romero was a pacifist, but he certainly caused me to see my own tradition's pacifist convictions in a new way, and helped me build a new connection to my own faith tradition, and one that stays with me to this day. Romero was an inspiration to say that the church in violent times needs to have something to say and something to do, and that can be costly. And so that was part of my own coming of age as a person within my own faith tradition. The other thing that watching that film did is it caused me to want to go to Central America. I want to find out what was happening and to pay attention in Spanish class, which was really good. So I went to Central America as a sophomore in college, spent a semester in Guatemala, but I also visited El Salvador, got to see the convent and the church where Romero was murdered. And following graduation, I went back to Central America to live and work for 6 years, from 1997 until 2003. I lived in Guatemala City, but I did a lot of traveling throughout Latin America in my work with the Mennonite Central Committee. And it was during those years that violence was changing in Central America. These were post-Civil War years, post-Peace Accord years, and perhaps we shouldn't have been surprised, but I think it did catch many of us as a surprise that the violence didn't go away, it changed. It changed nature, especially in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And I think that has largely to do with the fact that neither the wars nor the peace accords did much to address the deep and abiding economic inequality that exists in Central America. Central America has some of the steepest socioeconomic pyramids in the world. And in the 1970s and 80s, if you were a young man who was angry, frustrated with those steep and impossible economic pyramids, you could pick up a gun and do something about it by joining the guerrillas. In the 1990s and 2000s, if you were angry and frustrated about the hopelessness of the abiding steep economic pyramids, you could pick up a gun and join the gangs. Now, I'm not arguing that the gangs and the guerrillas are the same thing. They're very different. They're very different kinds of organizations, but they responded to the same underlying deep and abiding economic, socioeconomic, and racial inequality that exists in Northern Central America right up to this day. A key difference is that for the guerrillas, addressing that economic inequality with a gun was ideological. For the gangs, it was entrepreneurial. And that shouldn't come as any surprise because the organizers of the transnational gangs, the young men who came from Los Angeles, came from the United States, the global capital of entrepreneurialism. So big surprise that the new shift in violence was that it became very entrepreneurial and not very ideological at all. But it was a way to do something about it using violence. 50,000 Central Americans were deported, Central Americans with a criminal record were deported in the space of a decade to Northern Central America. Enrique was a young former gang member that I interviewed from San Salvador in 2007. I always started my interviews after getting to know the interviewees, I would ask them, dime cómo llegaste a ser miembro de la pandilla. Tell me how you ended up in the gang. Enrique told me the story of losing his father to a work accident when he was very young, and then losing several uncles and aunts to military violence, and feeling like a young man bereft of hope, bereft of connection. Like many, and I'll read from my, my book, like many young Salvadoran children coming of age in a post-war society, Enrique remembered casting about in search of a sense of security, thank you, and identity. He said, "You're left in orbit without anyone. It was only by sheer strength that my mom was able to keep us going, you know, and as a kid, you just want something to get your mind off it all. And so this guy named Ninosa, a deportee, shows up with a gang structure from the United States and wants to set up shop here, and he's telling us all about it, and what do? You join up. It's the logical thing to do for a young man in the early 1990s in post-war San Salvador. The MS-13 found fertile ground in organizing gangs. In many cases, they didn't create the gangs ex nihilo. They didn't create them out of nothing. They essentially colonized local street gangs that already existed and weaponized them. After all, these weren't just broken post-war economies. These were contexts, urban contexts, where a sense of hopelessness and shame was rampant among urban youth. And I often tell my students that if you want to add violence to the world, humiliate a young man. It doesn't matter if it's in Columbine, Colorado, or Palestine, or San Salvador. If you humiliate a young man, you are likely to see violence as the ultimate price of that humiliation. And I discovered or concluded from listening to ex-gang members talk about their experience that gangs provide tools for escaping an experience of chronic shame. Again and again, when I asked the young men, tell me how you ended up in the gang, I heard stories of profound and deeply debilitating chronic shame, followed by stories of escape from that spiral of shame via gang affiliation and the experience of violent rituals within the gang. One Guatemalan ex-gang member told me of the day when the weapons cache came from the M18, when his local gang affiliated with the M18, they got their weapons. And I said, tell me what that was like. And he said, oh, when I held that 38 special, it was just amazing. I remember his deep and long sigh when he was remembering finally, this is a man who'd been out of the gang for years. It was a feeling of empowerment, opportunity to escape, temporarily at least, the shame spiral. It wasn't always being able to act on violence. It was also even to the point of experiencing violence. Another young man, Pancho, from San Pedro Sula, Honduras, told the story of the day that he was jumped into the gang. And 80 young men came to witness, the gang members came to witness his jumping in ceremony with he and his best friend. And he said, three guys beat on me for about 3 minutes straight. And when it was all over, I was so beaten and bloody that I had to spend a week in my bed. He said, I never felt better because I was un pandillero. I was a gang member now. That sense of belonging. We're wired for connection. And for young men, for young people, it's even more profound. And so that experience of being beaten, but then brought in as a full participant in the gang is deeply, profoundly inspiring for the young men. So gangs are a means of leaving, this is part of what I argue in the book, a means of leaving a spiral of chronic shame via pathways to respect, at least temporarily exiting the shame spiral. Because there's competition in the gang. The more you participate in the gang, the more you do on behalf of the gang, the more valuable your head becomes to the opponents. the less you can go out. The more you need to start looking over your shoulder. There's also a lot of infighting within the gang, and gang violence tends to have a boomerang effect. What goes around comes around. And the vida loca lifestyle, the crazy lifestyle of lots of drugs and alcohol. In some gangs, it's more a fact of life than in others, but in many of the young men that I interviewed, the vida loca came with a price tag. It carries this pound of flesh, and after a number of years, many of the young men in the gangs started to talk about me aburrí, which literally means I got bored of the gang. But I think a better translation in this context is I got sick and tired of the gang. I got sick and tired of looking over my shoulder. I got sick and tired of worrying about where I could go and when I could come and go. I got sick and tired of sleeping with a weapon under my pillow. But the morgue rule, hasta la morgue, the slogan that says all the way to the morgue, is a mantra. It's a calling card. It's a rallying cry at first, all the way to the morgue. We're in this all the way to the death. But if you start to consider leaving the gang, you're likely to hear this from leaders. Remember, you're in this all the way to the morgue. And the message is, it's a lifetime commitment, so don't even think of leaving. But it turns out in some, but not all gang cells, at least in the mid-2000s, 2007 and 2008, there was one little loophole in the morgue rule, the all the way to the morgue rule, and that was if you convert to Christianity and you show evidence that your life really has changed and that you're making a sacrifice on behalf of this new conversion, we'll leave you in peace for at least as long as you show that you are living up to your newfound faith. And so what I call the evangelical exemption exists, or existed at least in 2007 and 2008 when I did my research all across Northern and Central America. In many cells, it was the case that if you want to leave the gang, really only the safe way out was to join an evangelical church and show that you were serious by not smoking, drinking, or going to discos, and by formalizing romantic relationships. All of which takes quite a bit of commitment for a young man in the barrio. Since I wrote my book in the 2000s, or in the early 2010s, some have argued that evangelical exemption no longer exists. There seems like Jose Miguel has found some evidence that at least in San Salvador, it's still there, at least in some cases. And now there's this phenomenon at the San Francisco Gotera prison, where an entire prison of ex-gang members or of gang members, which was meant for the M18 revolucionarios, a particular wing of the gang, is now made up of hermanos, brothers and sisters in Christ. And there was a really interesting piece by Carlos Martinez in El Faro a couple of weeks ago, elfaro.com, which is really, I think, an excellent news blog. And Carlos Martinez is this writer who, a self-proclaimed atheist, who has been watching what's happening in Gotera and is completely kind of astounded by what he's seeing there. And he says, I'm just going to quote a little piece where he's talking about gangs and churches, making an argument similar to what I make in the book, that there's some similarities between gangs and evangelical churches in Central America, in sociological terms, not in ethical terms, of course. Martinez says, in El Salvador today, evangelical churches have a monopoly on the idea of redemption. In the gang imaginary, they symbolize the widest, most sought after, most effective doorway for abandoning a structure to which they have pledged their lifelong loyalty. And of course, Martinez hastens to add that these new converts who found a new lease on life and at least temporary safety from the gang and a feeling of belonging, inclusion, reality is going to hit them pretty hard when they leave the prison. especially if the state continues to refuse to provide any reasonable rehab or reinsertion program for these young men, and if their communities refuse to trust them. And so it can't be a work only of the local church. And which is, I think, speaks well of the fact that at least that the Catholic Church, which tends not to speak the language of restoration quite so much, it has been better at pushing the government to provide resources for reintegration and reinsertion. Because redemption really is a precarious phenomenon. It requires ongoing work, and I found that out when I went back to the ex-gang members who I had originally interviewed in 2007 and 2008. Of the 63 that I had interviewed, I was able to get some data on about half of them in 2013. And of those, about half of those were involved in a church of some sort and doing well. Another 7 or 8 were struggling in a number of ways, and 7 were no longer alive. And so, despite their best efforts, and many but not all cases, they had left by way of a church, reality is still very hard, and some of those conversions stumbled after their life in the gang, and those stumblings cost them very dearly. Sometimes it cost them their lives, and other times it seems like other factors were involved. But some of those young men who had left the gang had found a new lease on life and were very active, healthy, supporting a family, and doing well and integrated. And in many, but not all cases, a church was helping them to do that. I wrote my book because I believe the church has a moral obligation to address violence as an affront to the God-given human dignity that we have. This is, I think, part of what Romero's life and testimony convinced me of. In Central America today, a small but not insignificant number of congregations and parishes continue to do that. I think Romero would be applauding them if he were here today. And that's what I have to share.
Well, first of all, thank you to Peter and Anna for having me here. Celebrating the legacy of Romero and talking about gangs. Before I get into the topic of gangs, Central American gangs, and since Robert gave his story about with Romero, let me just start with that too, because somehow this is related to my decision, my ultimate decision to study violence and in gangs in Central America. I grew up in El Salvador, and as I was growing up, I basically lived through the Civil War. But one of the most, one of the memories I have very much still in my brain is when the assassination of Romero, and this is for different reasons, but what I remember very well is I was 14 years old at that time. And I was with my grandmother. My grandmother was very conservative Catholic. In the previous days, although almost everybody at home listened to the homilias of Romero, she never did that because she was uneasy about Romero, right? She was a kind of conservative Catholic, and she saw Romero as this kind of pro-communist bishop, right, over there, and I remember very well when the news came that Romero had been killed the next morning. I mean, the news didn't come up the same day; they come up at least in the radio the next morning. I remember her very well saying something like this. Este país no tiene perdón de Dios. Han matado a un obispo y este país no va a tener salvación. That's what she said. Which in English was something like, this country doesn't have forgiveness anymore. Something like that. They have killed a bishop. So there's no more forgiveness for this country. So that stuck in my brain, and also and then obviously 9 years later also Jesuits were killed. One of the Jesuits, National Martin Barro, was my thesis advisor when he was killed. So all that I have a perennial question of why violence? Why are these countries so violent? So in that lane, I decided to study psychology, and then I convinced myself that the response is a political response, so that's why I moved to political science. So that's how I got to studying these issues. So I've been studying gangs since 1990s. When basically they started appearing in Central America, or people that started talking about them in Central America, specifically in San Salvador. And I'm going to provide a sort of overview of based on what I have seen, what I know is kind of the background, the conditions that have led to this phenomenon, gangs in Central America, and somehow the history of gangs, right? So let me start by simple definitions, what I consider to be the Central American gangs or Central American maras, right? These are a network of small groups, usually called cliques, operating in different communities united by the same identity. MS-13, Mara Salvatrucha, right, and the 18th Street Gang. So when we talk about gang, when we talk about Central American Maras, basically we're talking about these two organizations, right? The important thing here is that their identities were taken from Southern California, right? And are related to the US gangs with the same name, right? And this is a key point. And as you all know, they mainly operate in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, and the United States. There have been some copycats elsewhere, and from time to time, you hear, there are some MS-13 is in Europe now, or MS-13 is in Australia, or MS-13 is, but these are more kind of copycats, so groups of gangs or kids trying to emulate those use the name, but they haven't been able to establish a significant foothold. Now, what is interesting about them is that they have transformed into these powerful protection brackets in Central America. In El Salvador, in Honduras, in some places in Guatemala, basically they work more closely as a kind of criminal organization than the typical street gang, the typical street corner gang, right? Their main criminal economic activities, illegal protection, extortion, right? In the communities they occupy. They are extremely violent, right? They are capable of terrible things, really terrible things. And although they vary by location, they also participate in local drug trafficking. Some cliques are trying to move to kind of more international drug trafficking, but haven't been able to. Sicariato, hitmen, and provide security to some drug transshipments. That's what they do. So to understand the phenomenon of Central American gangs or maras, we need to differentiate the factors behind their emergence. I mean, how they appear originally, right? And how they continue, even some of them continue joining some gangs, and what I call their evolution into sort of criminal organization. So there are two sets of factors here. One set of factors explain the emergence of gangs, and these are very similar to those factors that you find anywhere else in the world, right? Anywhere else where you have a youth gang, a street gang, all these are very similar. And then you have other factors that I think explain how they evolved to be what they are now. In terms of the emergence of gangs in Central America, there are many factors. I'm just listing some of the some that I consider important. All the social exclusion processes, social and economic marginalization that has continued and even increased in Central America, especially in Northern Central America. Also, the socialization into violence, kind of culture of violence, this idea that the only way to solve anything, you know, is using violence, right, or aggressive behavior. Also, rapid and unplanned urban growth. This has been this characteristic in Central America for some years, especially after the civil wars. Cities have been growing in a very unplanned way, disorganized way, and that has contributed to the emergence of gangs. If you go to some communities in San Salvador, in San Pedro Sula, in Guatemala, you see these land or these huge places in small houses, very small houses. It's basically impossible for a kid, you know, to have a decent life, right? Quality life in there. And they have to go to the streets, and even they go to the street, there's no safe places in the streets, right? There are no plazas, parks, or community centers where they can enjoy being kids, young people. Community disorganization, availability of drugs and weapons. Well, Central America is inundated with weapons, guns, not only because of the weapons that were left after the wars, but also because there have been this drive by the elites, the local elites, to import as many guns as possible to Central America. I remember a report in the early 2000s that showed, for instance, that El Salvador, this tiny country in the world, El Salvador, was the 6th buyer of guns from the United States, right? According to data of the Department of Commerce in the US. So if you can imagine, El Salvador was buying more guns from almost any other country in the world. Right? So put those guns in the hands of marginalized youth, and then you'll have this, you know, explosive equation. Also, problematic families, dysfunctional homes, abuse, and one of the things that cross all over the gang members I have talked to is that they were abused when they were kids, right? All of them, almost without exception, were abused when they were kids. One gang member once told me, when I asked him, right, I mean, this is the typical question from, you know, an outsider, right? Academic, why do you join gangs? Why do you know you're gonna be killed? You know that you're going to end up in prison, and that will be okay for you because you're not gonna be killed, but why are you joining gangs? And he said something like this, well, you know, when I was at home, everybody beat me, right? My stepfather, my mother, everybody, and I couldn't do anything, right? In the street, I can pay them back. I can retaliate. I'm able to retaliate, right? So that's what the gang gives me, the possibility to pay them back for what they did to me, right? And this is something similar to what Robert just said. I mean, you humiliate a young man, and then you have like friends and peers involved in gangs. I mean, if you have your friends involved in gangs, well, the normal thing to do for you is join gangs, and then also the local dynamics of violence. So those were what I see as the factors behind the emergence of gangs. What about the evolution of gangs? I think there are two factors that explain that, and that these factors help explain why we have the Mara Salvatrucha now in the way that we have it, why we have the 18 street gang in the way we have it. Those two factors are migration and deportation and state policies. I'm going to take very quickly, I'm going to talk very quickly about that. So the migration and deportation. We have talked about that. Well, you'll hear about that. Circular migration between Central America and the United States generated what, in my opinion, and following a sociologist called Peggy Levin, called social remittances. The important thing about migration, in my opinion, is not that, gang members from LA, from Southern California, inundated Salvadoran streets. In my opinion, that didn't actually happen in the sense that sometimes it's portrayed by the media, right? You read stories in the media and it seems like, oh, those gangs, all of them went to Central America, to San Salvador, and they created gangs over there. It wasn't like that. I'm more in the line of what Robert said before, that basically they helped those who went to Central America, where, a specific number, they helped shape the gangs that were already there, right? They took this culture of being gang member, they took to Central America, and that culture shaped the dynamics of gangs already existing in Central America. They taught the local gang members the cultural ways of being a gang member, right? And they also, from the United States to Central America, they exported these gang identities. This identity of MS-13 and this identity of the 18th Street gang. And as I said, those cultural forms were transformed in Central America. Gangs in Central America suffered their own evolution, right? In some ways separated from the dynamics and the evolution in Southern California. So that's one. And the second one, and I think this is in my view, this is the most important one, were state policies. But despite all the changes, the political reforms after peace accords, state policies continued criminalizing youth, right? And that kind of policies galvanize gangs into this brutal violence. And I'm following some ideas from the literature on gangs here that said that threats are great sources of cohesion and organization, right? What happened was that the states in Central America, they defined marginalized youth and gangs as the big threat to their security, to their national security. Very similar to what you see now Trump doing here in the United States, right? I mean, the culprit of everything evil was those young kids. So we had to go after them. And because of that, governments in early 2000s implemented these mano dura or zero tolerance policies, right? And these zero tolerance policies allow governments, on the one hand, allow governments to go after gangs in a legal way, right? But also allow some people associated with the state and some former operators in the state to go against gangs too in an informal way. So you have all these, well, the former escuadrones, the former groups of, you know, doing extra legal activities. Now they directed their activities no longer after the guerrillas and the communists and the leftists, but after the youth kids who were in gangs, right? So there's some continuity from the days of the civil wars, from the days of the repression in the 70s, 80s, to the 90s and the 2000s, in which now the new enemy were these kids. So you have these vigilantes, and that's what's going after the kids. So let me, let me describe what I see are the the 4 stages that Central American gangs experience through the years, right? I have defined, in my view, that there might be more, there might be less, but in my view, I think there are 4 well-defined phases or stages in this kind of evolution of Central American gangs. The first stage, around the early 1980s and 1992, the parallel formation of gangs in Southern California and El Salvador. And I call this parallel formation because at the beginning, during this period, there was not too much contact between gangs in San Salvador and the gangs in the United States. The second stage is the fusion and accommodation in El Salvador, right? There is this period after the Civil War, during the post-war period, in which, you know, these 2 phenomena, the gangs in San Salvador and the gangs in the United States, basically started to merge, and the gangs in El Salvador started to accommodate based on the cultural remittances coming from the US. The third stage is what I call the transformation in El Salvador. This is the moment in which these young youth gangs, these street corner gangs, basically start transforming into what they are in some way now. And the fourth stage is kind of this corporate organization, in which they are, although they still work as a cliques, as community gangs, but they have a sort of more corporate view of how to function, institutional view how to function. Very quickly, the first stage, as I said, from the early 1980s till 1992, you find these conditions of multiple marginalization that gave way to gangs in San Salvador and Southern California, right? Their own conditions in each country, in each place generate these gangs. In LA, in Southern California, Salvadoran immigrants in LA joined existing gangs and they all created their own clique. This is the moment in which MS-13 is formed in Southern California. At the same time, in Central America, disaffected youth created a myriad of barrio gangs. And during this period, in the 1980s, in the midst of the Civil War, you have several small gangs, right, with many different names. So you hear, in this moment, you hear different gangs called Mara Chancleta, Mara ACDC, Mara No Se Dice, Mara Morazan. There's, you know, almost a gang for every barrio in San Salvador. And there's a similar process in Guatemala too, actually. taking place, right? In some way, these gangs in San Salvador were already starting to become a problem for some places. And here I have stolen a picture from El Faro, right? This is the cover of one of the newspapers in El Salvador, and this is a newspaper. This is a cover from 1989, right? It's Ofensiva Policial contra las Maras, right? Crackdown against the maras, the gangs, right? This is way before we were talking about, MS-13 or 18th Street Gang. That were already, that was already a piece of news then. This is 1989, way before the return of many migrants. Then the second stage, from 1992 to around 2000, what I call the fusion and accommodation in El Salvador, circular migration and deportations of hundreds of youth to Central America. And as I explained before, they took social remittances with them, cultural assets and norms of the streets, and existing gangs in Salvadoran communities adopted those forms and their identities. This is a critical moment because, as I said, I started doing research on gangs in 1996. And at that moment, I remember interviewing some gang members say, well, we're changing our name. We changed our name to MS-13 or 18th Street Gang because those guys over there in the other community, they are 18s and we are enemies. So we don't like them. So in order to be real enemies, we have to be MS-13, right? So they adopted MS-13 as part of the dynamics, the local dynamics of violence, right? And that allowed this kind of diffusion of these identities, gang identities coming from the US. Then the third, and during this period, well, I mean, basically what you have is different gangs, different cliques, various cliques called MS-13, 18th Street Gang, but they really didn't have any significant connection between them. If you were an MS-13, let's say somewhere in San Salvador, you didn't know the MS-13 people who were in Soyapango, in Ilopango, in other communities in San Salvador. Basically, you didn't have any significant connection other than calling yourself the same name, MS-13. Then the third stage, from 2001 to 2012, 2010, 2012, more or less, this is the critical moment in which they transform into this national organization. And this was facilitated by the mano dura policies. The mano dura policies happened, and these state policies increased group cohesion and helped to develop brand new hierarchical organization. I'm going to explain that in a minute. Also, during this period, armed groups linked to the state provided internal legitimacy to gangs in their fight against state institutions. So some of the interviews I did during this period, people were saying, look, we're being hunted by the state, by the police, but also by these other guys who are associated with the police. They are not police, but they are with the government, right? So in order to defend ourselves, we have to prepare, we have to, strengthen, you have to get more guns, more weapons. We have to have some strategy. So this is the moment in which they see this as a war against the state. And the critical element in this was the massive incarceration that happened. So what happened was with the zero tolerance with the mano dura policies, and then super mano dura policies, basically the state or the government put thousands of kids from different places of the country in a single prison, in single prisons, let's say, right? A prison just for MS-13 and a prison just for 18th Street Gang. And I'm sorry, going to use this. I'm sorry, but this is basically the way it works. So you have kids from, one city or even one country, right, being arrested. A kid from another city, and they put them all together in the same prison. In those days, the Chalatenango prison was an 18th Street National Prison. So what you do is you put all of them together, right? And you just lock them up and forget about it completely, right? It didn't matter what happened inside, right? They didn't have any program or anything. They just put them all together in this prison, in this room, right? And forget about them, because the only thing that mattered was that they won't escape, right? So you have all those rings around the prison, but where it happens inside doesn't matter. So what the state did was to put, right, kids from different parts of the country who share, this identity called 18th Street, but they really didn't know what that meant. They put it all together, right? 24/7. 24/7. So what do you do 24/7, right? With all kids, 18, you're 18. I mean, all the values here, great, right? So they start organizing there. They start electing leaders, right? Whoever is, the smartest, whoever is kind of the brilliant, then start, basically becoming the leader, right? And developing structures, right? And also because they are in prison, they have some connections with organized crime, right? And they start doing, making some deals with organized crime. Okay, we can do some things for you. I mean, you can provide us some weapons or help us, get something else. So this is the critical moment in which these youth gangs, who are corner gangs, they start basically organized. Right? This is the critical moment in which they become this sort of national organization. This doesn't mean that they abandon the model of being cliques or having their local cliques, but they now have a different scope, right? A different perspective of how to work, right? And in addition, during this period, right, during this all-out war against gangs, informal groups, paramilitaries and vigilantes against gangs emerge as informal extension of the state, right? So you don't only have police after the gang, but you also have these guys who are, vigilantes, death squads going after the gangs. Why this is important? This is important because the gangs realize that, and at some moment they decide, well, instead of going after that military guy, that soldier, or that police officer over there, which is with uniform, it's easier to go after whoever is collaborating with them, whoever we know is part of this squad, right? Who has a family, who is a civilian after all, and it's easier to go after these civilians than after going to the police officer. So this is the moment in which you see violence going up, right? Skyrocketing. You can see it here very clearly. These are, the homicides and extortions according to the police between 1998 and 2011. And you can see how, for instance, you can see here, for instance, so the mano dura started in 2003, super mano dura 2004, and you can see how after that homicides went up and extortions followed, right? This is the moment in which violence goes up in part as a result of the mano dura. And this graph and the data we have defeats all the notion that you put in place a security policy that ends up increasing the levels of violence in El Salvador. And then the percentage of gang-related homicides in El Salvador, you can see also very clearly how after 2003, the percentage of gang-related homicide just went up, right? So that takes us to the fourth stage. By 2008, street gangs have consolidated into national organizations with defined leaderships and structures. By 2010, they were starting to act strategically, right? Because they have this kind of notion of how to increase or decrease violence. And that view basically takes them to the truce, to negotiate the truce. After all, the truce was an effort of the gangs, right, to reap some benefits from the government. I'm not going to get too much into the truce because Hector is talking about the truce, I think, tomorrow. But you see, the truce is not possible if you don't have a consolidated and organized or a well-organized group, right? And that's what happened with the gangs in 2012. The truce in El Salvador signals the level of institutionalization and sophistication achieved by the Salvadorian gangs, right? Criminal activities in this period are shaped by leadership decisions. Although a great deal of activity is determined by local conditions and the dynamics of each clique, top-down decisions play an important role steering the behavior of gang members. So during this period, and I interviewed several gang members during this period, you talk to gang members and they just wanted to keep killing, right? They just want to kill we saw like my enemy, but they couldn't because there was a line, there was a decision, there was an order saying, no, you can't do that, right? You can't do that because we have the truce, right? A leadership, a decision is strategic and political. At the same time, that means that at the local level, some leaders, some gang leaders struggle to keep control, right? Because as I said, some of them just want to keep, in the dynamic of violence. However, they keep extorting, right? And as if you have followed, the truth, yeah, the violence, the homicidal violence went down, but extortion never ceased, right? Why? Because they have to keep getting money. There is a great interview again by the Faro people during this period in which one of the leaders of MS-13 says, MS-13 is not going to dissolve, right? We're not going to dissolve. So the truth wasn't about demobilization, right, of the gang. It was all about just reducing violence because they have found that provided some leverage. They provided them some leverage with the government, but they were never thinking of demobilizing. You can see that very clearly. Again, the mano dura, you see this increase. Then the truce, the homicides went down dramatically, right, with the truce. And then when the truce collapses, right, and the 2014 elections approach, right, the gangs also decided to increase violence as a way to push the government to the table, to the negotiation table. And that's why we have this increase, this terrible increase of violence about 2015, in which El Salvador reached 102 homicides per 100,000 during that year. So what is next? What is next? And this is the question I want to leave you with. This is all I have for you today. Thank you.
Thank you to both presenters. We have about half an hour now open for questions, comments.
I have one question for Jose Miguel. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's very interesting and pedagogical. Thinking about the war with the Maras, I was thinking about what about if there was collaboration between the gangs and the police, for example, with, I don't know, drug trafficking, did they or pay commission to the police, or how, for instance, you said that all these important import of guns to the country, so we can imagine that they were legally imported, right? So if there are connections between the police and Maras, so these guns circulate. So what about the connections? I mean, there is this horrible war, but what about the connections between police forces and the gangs?
Yeah, there were some connections actually. There were different connections at the local level depending on the clique, right? Some cliques, some cells at the local level have, you know, some kind of some have police people within their own ranks, right? Or they have some kind of collaboration. Or sometimes what you also found is that the gang extorted the people, and the police extorted the gang, right? So the local police also will extract money from the gang in order to let them do whatever they want, right? So you have that. And also you have these cases in which even police authorities have some kind of arranged deal with gang leaders, right? There was a police chief, national police chief, that basically have some deals with one of the leaders of the King Street gang, right? And even there are pictures of them too, right? You know, basically going to an event, right? Feria Ganadera, I can't remember how to say that in English, but it was an event in which, you know, public pictures of them too, basically, you know, sharing and doing things like that. So yeah, there were some kind of collaboration in that sense at different levels, and depending on the cliques too. It wasn't that systematic, but it existed. Yeah.
Maybe we can ask too when you before you ask a question, maybe just say your name.
Okay, Romero from Chile, at the Kellogg Institute. You just mentioned like one line about the extreme violence related to the Maras or the gangs. In the rest of Latin America, we're very used to, you know, another type of gangs, you know, mainly related to traditional crime or drug trafficking. But we associate Maras with very extreme and brutal violence. So to both of you, I mean, what is the explanation of that brutal and extreme violence? Where did it came from, and how is it justified by their members?
Well, I would say violence has an expressive side. It's not just strategic. So in certain cases, a certain kind of violence delivers a particular kind of message. So in Guatemala, and it kind of goes in waves. In Guatemala in the mid-2000s, there were a series of beheadings. And it was, I think it was partly because violence is a vernacular. I learned that from somebody here in the Kroc Institute, Father, he retired recently, who talked about the vernacular of violence. Violence is an idiom. And so at the time, the mid-2000s, there were these high-profile public beheadings in Iraq that were being videotaped and so on. And I think there was an attempt at copycat violence to say, hey, we're just as brutal and powerful and as brutal with our enemies as they were. So it's brutal violence conducted toward someone who has wronged the gang in some particular way. Who either they're a mole and we're giving information to the opposing gang, or giving information to the police or something. That's the accusation anyway. And so, you know, in Guatemala, there was a case where there was and this was happening in Salvador too recently, where it was dismemberment and putting the different pieces of the body in different places, again, to send a message, including with young women, this has happened. And the idea is don't cross the gang. It's communicative. It's intended to deliver a message. You know, it's horrible. It's awful. I think that's the most typical reason that I can think of.
Yeah, I think there is some kind of continuity in Central America of the violence experienced and exerted during the civil wars and previously, basically it was transmitted in some way to the gangs, right? The gangs learn from, that's why I emphasize, you know, this role of, as you saw, this role of vigilantes, death squads, because the gangs started, you know, experiencing that, and they started, you know, paying with the same coin, right? I remember two different interviews that lead me to this. One is one gang member once told me something like this. You know, the police believes that they can do with us whatever they want, but we are not guerrillas. Something like this. We're not guerrillas. Because you were a guerrilla member, you cannot pay them, you cannot do to them what they do to us, right? Because the guerrillas have to be in good standing with the people, right? Guerrillas have to be in good standing with the people. We don't care. We don't care about that because we just want to retaliate. We just want them to suffer what we have suffered, right? So what he was saying is that we don't care about legitimacy with the population, right? So that allow us to violate whatever, you know, restriction we have of human life and these kind of things, right? So I remember very well because it showed this thinking of, you know, we don't care about legitimacy in the way that guerrillas did, right? So that's one. The other thing was, I once interviewed a gang member who were a gang member in LA. Now he was in San Salvador. And he said something like this: these people here are crazy. These people here are crazy. And you hear that a lot in talking with them, or especially in LA. These people here are crazy. They don't respect rules here. They don't respect rules because in LA, you know, there are some limits. You cannot do a lot of stuff. Here it doesn't matter. Right? Here it doesn't matter those rules. I mean, I can see somebody, I can be walking with my mother and with my kids, and they will just, you know, basically kill me on the spot, and they will, you know, have a drive-by shooting here. In LA, you don't do that. You don't kill, you don't target people with their families. Right? We have these rules. We have these rules in LA. People don't respect here those rules here at all. They just want to kill. But this is a different logic, and I think the context, the local conditions basically shape the way of how they respond to violence.
I hope I'm not unfair to Miguel, because Romero is going to talk about it. Of course, I'm sorry. Why is it, in your view, that the government, with respect to the troops, denied it until it was completely impossible to deny it? And why is it that the Secretary General of the OAS supported his troops as a form of reducing violence, gang violence?
Why the government denied it? I think they denied it because they somehow anticipate what the reaction was going to be, and the reaction that actually happened right afterwards. And this is, you know, the condemnation of most of the society, right? The government denied it because in some way you were, I mean, the government was actually dealing, talking with gang members and criminals, right? And it denied, basically they have to accept it because El Faro published that, and then, you know, they kept showing evidence of those things, you know, of the dealing between the government and gangs. But the government kept doing that and denying because they anticipated that it won't be seen, it won't be viewed well by the population. And actually that's what's happened, right? You know, I remember our colleague Janet Aguilar did some surveys after the truce, showing certainly that 70% of Salvadorans were against the truce, were against negotiating with gangs, not only because of this idea of negotiating with the gangs, but also because people saw that, yeah, the gangs were not killing anymore, but they kept extorting, right? They kept, you know, they kept controlling the barrio, they kept controlling the neighborhoods. They were not going away, right? They were still there. So I think that's the main reason. Why the OAS supported? I think in a context in which, you know, the narrative was, well, we have tried this, we have tried that, we have tried all these different measures, and nothing works. Nothing works. When you see the truth, at least the first months, you know, when you see those results of violence going down, that basically, you know, convince some people, not only the OAS, but some other people that, you know, that might be a good strategy after all, right? Because you saw the results go with the violence going down, right? In my opinion, that was a little bit naive on them. I remember writing something saying, the problem with this is that after this, we're going to see a lot of violence after that, because the gangs now have learned that if you want to extract some benefits from the government, you just have to manipulate the homicide statistics, right? And and actually that's what was happening. The leaders just order to their gang members, hey, this is the time to kill, go and kill whoever you want, right? Or this is time to restrain, right? Not to do that. I think if we're going to talk about truth, and I don't want to talk about truth now because we have a panel on that, but if we want to negotiate with gangs, we need to do it within a framework of demobilization, which never was under the table. It was on the table when the truth happened, right? And I think that was the mistake in this case of those that were involved in the truth.
Yes, right here.
For Robert Brennan, you said that one route out of the gangs was through the evangelical churches. Is it not possible for someone to return to the Catholic Church and be safe or be allowed to live a non-gang life?
Well, that's a good question, and I wish I had asked it of every ex-gang member from the beginning, but I didn't expect the results to be so one-sided, and so I started asking ex-gang members that very question. And the responses varied from just bewilderment, like how do you convert to Catholicism? That's just not an idea in the minds of a Central American barrio member, that it doesn't, and in part because well, as Martinez points out in the gang imaginary, redemption, that transformation of identity is something that the evangelical congregations, Pentecostal evangelicals, have kind of a monopoly on. And that's partly, I think, because in the Catholic imaginary in Latin America, it's a theology of presence. It's a theology of accompaniment to the whole parish, the whole barrio, the whole neighborhood. And so you don't leave and come back. It's, whereas for the evangelical mind and theology, there's very much an idea that if you belong completely, and if you don't, you're out. So there's I'll say it in another way. There are clear markers for who belongs and who doesn't belong to a gang and to an evangelical church. There's clear vocabulary of language. You, at least in the barrios of Central America, you greet each other. Buenos días, hermano. Buenos días, hermana. ¿Cómo estás? Bendecido por la gracia de Dios. How are you, brother or sister? I'm very blessed by the grace of God. It's a whole lingo that goes with belonging to an evangelical church. And there are certain things you can't do. You can't drink or smoke or go with girls that do. You have to. It brings a lifestyle change with it. So of the 63 ex-gang members that I interviewed, 4 professed a Catholic identity, which if you think about for Central America, that is arguably 50% Catholic, only 4 out of 63, whereas 38 professed an evangelical identity of the 68 ex-gang members. And so one, just not thinking of the Catholic Church as a place you go to overhaul your identity, to become a new person. Along with the fact that the evangelicals, they are looking, not all of them, but many of the churches are looking for transformational stories of I once was lost and now I'm found. That not only is worth celebrating for the person, but it fundamentally validates the story that the evangelical church tells about itself. That this is a place where God is, where the Holy Spirit is active here, and look at this ex-gang member. You know what he used to be like, and here he is sitting among us. And they're willing to make big sacrifices and risk getting burned, and they do get burned sometimes, in order to have the possibility of having an ex-gang member here telling his testimony and showing that Jesus can save anyone, absolutely anyone. And so that's a powerful sort of motivator for these congregations and these pastors in particular. Pastors to go out and go knocking, go looking for them, go asking. I'll tell you one particular story in El Salvador. In 2007, I interviewed an ex-gang member who had just left like 6 months earlier in his home, and I asked him to tell me why his story, and I didn't know, but it came out that he had joined an evangelical church, and he told me the story, and he said, I was at my house, and the gang was looking for me, and I knew I had to make a change. And he said they were having a prayer meeting of charismatic Catholics, a Renovación prayer meeting in my house, and the women were praying for me, and I decided I had to make a change. So I went to my uncle's house. My uncle was a minister. My mother is Catholic. My immediate family is Catholic. But because I wanted to leave the gang, I went with my uncle because he could help me on this pathway of transformation. So I think it's a social, a theological, and a psychological convergence of factors that makes ex-gang members see evangelical conversion as really the only way. The other thing is that evangelicals gather with great frequency. And if you're a new convert, you got to be in church 5 nights a week. And that's actually a really good thing. I call it time hoarding. When somebody is trying to desist from crime or criminal activity or gang membership, what you need is a new set of social networks. And to make that possible, you need to have a place to gather with people not belonging to your old affinities, your gang affinities. You need a place to be on Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday night for a long time, in a place that's exciting and happening. And there isn't a more exciting and happening place in town, other than arguably the discoteca, than the Pentecostal church, the local Pentecostal church. There's activity, there's enthusiasm, there's excitement, there's music, it's loud, it's emotional, it's exciting, it's enthusiastic. And that, in some way, sociologically speaking, is kind of what the doctor ordered for somebody who is trying to get away from a group of guys that's waiting for him to show up. He's trying to not think about that. So he needs to, and new converts are supposed to be in church 5 nights a week. And so in that sense, that's another reason, I think.
Well, I have a question. So putting both of your fascinating presentations together, I was really struck, Robert, by your opening remark about how the shift in violence went from ideological to entrepreneurial. And so combining that with Jose's presentation, I'm just wondering, I find it interesting that, you know, the Romero, I mean, one of his last stands was against the rise of the multinationals and the transnational corporations and the exploitation of the poor in El Salvador. And I'm just wondering, with your kind of evolution, Jose, that you looked at the 4th stage, how transnational now are these gangs in terms of their organization as a corporation, and use that language? I mean, it seems to me that they're almost mimicking what we saw in the 70s and 80s and 90s with transnationals.
Well, there are some contacts, and I think they are transnational more in the cultural way than in terms of than in actual terms, right? I mean, they have tried, specifically the Salvadorian gangs, they have tried to establish some kind of links and systematic links to the gangs, especially in the East Coast, right around, you know, communities in DC, in Northern Virginia. They have tried to do that. They haven't been successful, right? I think that the transnationality is more cultural. It's a kind of cultural space that they inhabit than an actual one in which that allows them to coordinate actions, right? Even within Central America, within the Northern Triangle, I mean, MS-13 and 18th Street Gang, the national leadership, they do have certain control to some extent at the national level, but they cannot claim any authority or any control over what happens in Honduras or what happens in Guatemala. In Honduras, they have their own leaders and their own way of organizing, and actually the way they work is a little bit different, right? I mean, I was in Honduras just last week doing the next stage of my research on that. And the Honduran MS-13, for instance, is decisively trying to move more toward criminal organization, right? Keeping a very low profile publicly, and controlling and trying to get more and more into legal businesses, right? And the 18th Street Gang, on the other hand, in Honduras, you have to draw some comparisons in the way they work. In my opinion, the 18th Street Gang in Honduras works more similarly to the MS-13 in San Salvador, for instance, in the way they organize themselves, right? And that's interesting because you see the differences according to each place, right? To each locality. So that, again, going back to this transnational character is more in terms of, you know, the identities that are floating there, right? Instead of the actual organization, right? Across country.
Yeah.
Hi, Stephen Little from the University of Notre Dame Press. Bob, Dr. Cruz, Bob, thank you both for your presentations. In your discussions, both of you talked about the various dynamics by which violence begets violence, both in terms of creating the gang presences and perpetuating them. I hear different kinds of violence being, in some cases, more explicitly mentioned, and others kind of alluded to on the periphery. Lots, of course, of physical violence, murder, beatings. Not so much, I haven't heard, at least specifically here, and I'm an outsider, so I don't know a lot about what goes on. What about sexual violence? What about psychological violence? What about religious violence? Do these aspects play a role in any way, in a significant way, in first bringing about the success of the gangs and then furthering their activities? Thank you.
There is sexual violence, and there is a lot actually, and the way they treat women is we haven't talked about that much, but yes, there is a lot of sexual violence, and the way they treat women with these with different ways of raping and abusing women. They really are, they exert a lot of violence of that time, and also psychological in general at the community, right? They know that people fear them, and they use that in their advantage, right? Well, absolutely. They are able to control communities, and even at some point in the country, right? In Salvador, for instance, they have been successful in stopping, in shutting down the country in the past, just by spreading rumors that they're going to attack, transportation units, right? In my opinion, they don't have all the capacity to do that, not in the way they portray it, but just by saying, well, if the country doesn't shut down this day, we're going to kill, we're going to, put some units on fire, we're going to do this, and then basically, and they have been successful basically shutting down the country. That happened a couple of times, right? So in that way, well, they use those threats very effectively. And going back to sexual violence, they do, yes. And one of the things I remember from when I started doing research on gangs, at the beginning, women were more allowed openly to be gang members, right? That has changed to some extent. They are not right now, depending on where you are, but in general terms, they are not allowed to be full gang members. They are more like associates, right, with gangs that are full gang members. But at the beginning, they were allowed to be gang members. And some of the narrative to that from the women at that moment was, here in the gang, we have more liberty, we are respected. But as you see the way they were treated, the women within the gang, they were treated even worse than they were treated outside. But they bought into this idea that they were respected within the gang, even though they were, completely the opposite, right? They were used essentially as sexual objects, right? And when they stopped being sexual objects, basically they were killed, right? And some of the more gruesome killings are against women, actually, nowadays, right? So most of the women are killed by their own, as happens also in the rest of the society. Most of the killings of women are perpetrated by their own partners, right? If the woman decides to separate from the gang, well, basically these are the sentence on her, right? And when they are killed, they are tortured and do terrible things. So they are that kind of.
Yeah, and I would just add, I totally agree that want to add violence to the world, humiliate a young man. If you humiliate a young woman, she is more likely to allow violence to herself that she should not allow. And so that's where you see this just mind-boggling victimization of young women, especially early on in the gang. Young women are used as kind of one gang member called, he said, we use the women as bait. And what he meant was the gang attracts young men, 12, 13, 14-year-old boys to the gang by offering them the ability to participate in adult pastimes. You can smoke, you can drink, you can have access to the things that people say you're not supposed to have because you're just a child. And so again, it's an escape from chronic shame by means of shortcuts to adulthood. Adult pastimes that make you feel like I'm old now, and sex is one of them. And so gang leaders know this and try to attract young women to belong to the gang, saying, hey, here's some advantages. You can be one of us, you can be a gang member, and instead of accepting a beating, you need to accept sex with new members. And it's an ugly ritual that is, I heard it in all 3 countries as one more way that the gang sort of sells its opportunity to young boys who are looking for a way to feel like they're old and respectable.
At this point, sorry, we have to cut off because it's time for our lunch break, but let's carry the conversation on, and please return back to us at 1:30 for our second session here on contemporary perspectives on gangs, and join me once again in thanking our 2
presenters. The lunch set up in the next room, so everyone's welcome to join us for lunch. And we also have book tables. Jenna Knapp's book available for a small donation right here. And your book is available at the bookstore books table. And the press is going to have a book table out there. So buy books, eat lunch, enjoy yourself.
Thank you.